All right, guys, so the last video for emergence of organic molecules here. All right, so we started out with the micromolecules and they have to become macromolecules. So the earliest probionts, protobionts would be eventually create sugars and then nucleic acids, and then eventually we would get all the other ones. So the key function of life became enabled by RNA, like by allowing us to replicate. We get those identical copies of self. We have metabolism for storing energy. We have catalysis in the proteins for speeding up a favored chemical reaction. And once these three functions were developed, evolution accelerated. Everything blew up because then things could really copy itself and figure out how to move on. So once those three things occurred, evolution exploded. Okay. In the beginning, there was abiogenesis. Abiogenesis, without life forming, is to study how life could have arose from organic molecules through natural processes. So, in particular, we're learning how we got life-altering life substances from non-life microelements. So we had cyanobacteria as the oldest, simplest life form. How did those get life from a world without any other carbon life forms? So the topic outside of the scope of the AP test, so you don't have to worry about it too much, but if you want to know more, watch the video, get on the notes and check this guy, the Stozak, and his lab animation. It's pretty interesting, and you can start seeing how complex spheres could start to self-replicate and produce energy. It's pretty interesting. All right, the primitive cells that started on Earth, that actually started animating, making things move and create on Earth, were liposomes, and so they were phospholipids, like we learned in the lipid section, with their double tails and then their phosphoheads. So the heads love water, the tails hate water, remember? And so because of that, they were in a water-rich environment, and they arranged themselves to where only the outside would ever have the phospholipid heads, and the inside too, where anything that would touch water would have those phospholipid heads. And so anywhere in the center, water would not get trapped there and wouldn't lyse the cell. So before they became a liposome, they were a bilayer sheet. And after a bilayer sheet, then they became these little micelles, and then we got liposomes. So they acted as a barrier from the outside, and they enclosed the shape, and this is how we eventually got the first cell membranes, and then eventually things occurred to where we could get the other organelles. So the primitive cells, they were amphiphilic, remember, water-loving and water-hating. The head will attract water. The tail is nonpolar, it will repel water. And so water would want to come to the heads, but it wouldn't want to come to the tails. So at first, you had these protobionts, these precursors to life. They had their phospholipid heads. And this didn't work out for them so well, because then water would be on the inside and be touching this. So eventually they bilayered. And as soon as they bilayered, we could get these huge enclosed volumes, and, well, huge for cell versions, enclosed volumes, and things could fit in there. So within those protobionts, the processes of chemistry started getting more complex. We started making proteins and carbohydrates and lipids and nucleic acids within the cell. So the basic principles of organic compounds chemistry started in those earliest cells. LUCA, or the last universal common ancestor, is a protobiont that became more and more and more complex until finally we had RNA and DNA in them. LUCA, the last universal common ancestor, features all the features of life. It did everything that you need to be considered alive on Earth. So we believe the fact that everything that's living has these same characteristics came from the last common ancestor. So we call that LUCA. So we believe it is this much more probable than having multiple ancestors. So we believe that if we followed this through, bacteria and single-cell organisms and plants and fungi and animals would all end up having this LUCA, this last universal common ancestor that spread out, the thing that started the earliest form of life. Sorry, guys. All right, so some of the common features of all life on Earth that made us think that this LUCA was possible is that there is a universal genetic code that DNA and RNA kind of make all life structures possible. That there's base pair coding between all the same things. So A pairs with T, C pairs with G in DNA, and RNA, A pairs with U, and C pairs with G in RNA. DNA and RNA polymerases are universal throughout most of animals. That's what creates DNA and RNA. Polymerase is a large molecule that creates. mRNA is used in many life forms which send genetic information. The tRNA, transfer RNA, gathers the amino acids, and this happens in all living things. Ribosomes are there, and they're even in the most simple prokaryote, there's still ribosomes there, and they still assemble proteins. So these are things that we definitely, all living things, have in common. We also have L isomers of amino acids. So they actually, isomers are the different shapes of the same thing, and that'll change the way they act. So we all use the same L isomers, the same 20 amino acids build most of our proteins. Glucose is the ultimate energy source for pretty much everything, with a few exceptions. Plants make their own glucose and then they use it. So even though they need the energy from the sun to make it, they still utilize glucose in their cellular respiration. All cells have a lipid bilayer in the cell membrane. They have cellular division for growth, so that's mitosis, where it splits. Sodium and potassium ion pumps are in all of these, all the living things. ATP is the main currency for energy, and ATP synthase is how we make our own ATP. So these are all things that are in common. So just knowing that there's this many things, it really makes us think that we all had that common ancestor. None of the features on Earth would have been exactly this way. There was lots of problems that had to get overcome throughout time in different environments. So how would it come to be that all life uses all these common features if there was not a common ancestor? And that's a pretty good question, because if things all look the same, then they probably came from the same place, even if it was a long time ago. So Earth is 4.6 billion years ago. For the first 3.9 billion years ago, the environment was too hostile for life. We couldn't get anything. We were getting those larger molecules, but we were not getting life yet. The earliest fossil evidence happened about 3.5 billion years ago, and we believe LUCA occurred 3.9 to 3.5 billion years ago in that first bit. So cells, we found fossilized stromatolites, which are little layered rocks that form with certain prokaryotes bonded within each of the layer. Because we can see these prokaryotes, you can kind of figure out when things started living, and those shows us those earliest prokaryotes, and the earliest stromatolites that we found are 3.5 billion years ago. The cells were very limited in their capabilities and functions to perform life. They didn't do a ton of the life things, but they did most of it. Early prokaryotic cells are the simplest packet of chemicals capable of doing the functions that define life. So life is defined as a set of living conditions that separate abiotic, non-life, and biotic, living things. There are 7 conditions. Can you name them? And I'm going to ask you guys to tell me this in class. So come up with the 7 conditions for life. Write them down, and we'll talk about it in class. All right, so number 41. The creation of membranes from phospholipids. A, allowed for more complex chemistry. B, allowed bacteria to flourish. C, allowed lipids to make glycoproteins. Or D, allowed more amino acids to form. Did you say A? You are correct. By having that environment, enclosed environment, chemistry got to be way more intense. Evidence for the last universal common ancestor among life is, 1, that they all rely on photosynthetic reactions, they all utilize ATP, they all reproduce through mitosis, and they all are aerobic. So take a minute, decide what you need. Did you say B, they all utilize ATP? Good, because that's the one thing that all life forms do use. And that's it. So today we talked about how those earliest molecules started becoming actual living things, how we developed first the cell membrane, and then organelles got to be more complex and start producing their own functions, allowing the earliest cells to work. All right, so that's it for today, and I will talk to you guys later.